Hi, it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here with some PB&J holiday inspiration. And today I'll be working with our new slapstick cling stamp called Dresden Snow. And I'll be creating an easy winter scene that is so fun to create. You'll really feel like an artist when you're working with this stamp, but it's very easy to do. And here's just a quick peek at all of the supplies I'll be using in today's video to create this card. And I will put this right back up on screen for you at the very end of the video. So if you just watch on screen, that'll pop back up at the very end, and you can hit pause if you need to look at it in detail. So to begin, I am working in my stamp positioning tool, and I'm using the Misty by My Sweet Petunia, and I've positioned my stamp onto my paper and I'm going to begin inking it. I'm stamping onto Neenah Solar White cardstock, so I wanted a very smooth cardstock that would capture all of the details that are included in this beautiful stamp. I'm using Wendy Vecchi's Archival Ink for Ranger, and this is the color of Fern Green. And I love, this is the miniature size, so I love this for getting in on these stamps because I can just focus in on these evergreen trees to begin. And I'm stamping things a couple of times just to get a very good impression and just darken up that color a little bit. Now I'm going to take a distress marker. You could also use a Tombow dual brush pen or any type of marker that you use directly onto your stamps, a water-based marker. And this is just to add some extra shading in here. And this is the color of Forest Moss, and I'm just adding it in towards the center of the trees. And you don't need to be too particular about where you add this color. It just makes a big difference in how the whole scene looks just to have two different shades of green, a light and a dark. But for me, I find it's just easiest to focus on this sort of the center of the tree. Now over here on the, well, it will be the right when it's stamped, but it's on the stamp here directly, it's on the left hand side. I'm putting some more green. There's some evergreen trees tucked in here. I'm just inking that with that same color of green ink, following this same process. And that's one thing that's really great about using this stamp in a stamp positioning tool is you can work section by section and color by color to get each part of the stamp. So here I'm adding in that shading using the distress marker. I kind of turn it on the side on the brush tip and use a flicking motion to apply that. And you can also take that marker directly to your paper if there's just a few little areas that you want to darken. Sometimes it's easier to see them working directly on the paper than trying to decipher on the stamp where that is. And I just get kind of fiddly here. I like to stamp it, take a step back and look at what I've stamped and decide where I want some more just to balance things out. Now I'm going to work on the fence, so I'm using a Vintage Photo distress marker. So sometimes I use the miniature ink pads and sometimes I use the marker, and that's just kind of depending on the size of the area that I'm trying to cover. So the marker lets me get in real close on this detailed fence area. Now I did go ahead and add some of this marker ink to the tree. And I just kind of colored on the side with the brush tip to do that. But because it's such a large area and because there's a lot of detail, after I added this using the marker and kind of went back and forth, I remembered that I could just do it with the ink pad. So you'll see me go back over it with the ink pad. If I was doing this again, I would just start with the ink pad that I end up using. But you definitely could use the marker. In fact, I really kind of like this lighter color, this lighter look here that this has. There's so many different ways that you can do this particular stamp. You could do it all in browns and create a sepia look. You could keep things very light. You can change the background, so stamp everything the same as I'm doing here, but do the sky in different colors. There's just a lot of different options. So here I've grabbed that ink pad. This is another one of the miniature Wendy Vecchi colors of Archival Ink. This is the potting soil. I do use this brown all the time. And it's that miniature size, so you can get right up just on the area that you want to ink. You can see here I can get right close next to those evergreen trees and get the trunk of the tree. Just doing a couple of impressions to, again, darken things up. I did add a little bit of walnut stain here for a darker shade on the trunk and took that directly to the paper a little bit. So now that I've got everything stamped, I want to be sure to really clean off my stamp well, but I'm keeping everything in my stamp positioning tool. The next step will be to emboss the entire image. So I will ink the stamp using Versamark ink. I want to be sure that it's really dry before I add that ink. That way the ink will stick to the stamp and then stick to the paper. I'm patting my paper with an anti-static powder tool. This will just make sure that the embossing powder will stick only on the areas where I've stamped. And now I'm going to use that Versamark ink that I mentioned. Get some little fuzzies off here. And I will stamp right over the top. Now this is clear, and the embossing powder that I'm going to apply is clear also. But what that will do is seal in all of these colors so that when we add our inks to the background, that clear embossing powder will resist those inks, and the trees will stay a nice green, the brown will stay a nice brown, the fence will stay brown, everything will stay as it is, even with inks on top. And that saves us from having to do any type of masking on these trees when we do our inking for the background. Now one thing is, though, the stamp leaves the places for the snow on the trees, on both the evergreen trees and on the other tree. And so I want to make sure that those stay white. So I'm going to take a Versa marker. This is the same ink that's in that Versamark ink pad, and I'm just coloring over those areas that are white. Because those did not get stamped, I want to be sure that I get clear embossing powder on those areas too. So I'm just working in small sections again, so I'm sure that that ink does not dry before I sprinkle it with embossing powder. So you'll see now I sprinkle that with embossing powder, and it's just sticking to the areas where I colored with that pen, which is those white areas. And that way I will seal in those snowy areas so that when we add our ink to the background, they will remain white. I'm going to do the same thing over on this tree, and I've just picked a few of the branches where I want it to look like the snow is sort of piled up on the branches. And you can see that after you stamp it, those sort of open areas like right there, where it's sort of telling you that this is where the snow would be sitting on the branch. And so I'm just very lightly coloring on those areas, and then I'll sprinkle it with that embossing powder so that that gets sealed in as well. So I'll sprinkle that with embossing powder. You can see it stick just to those areas where I colored, and I'll heat that to set. And then finally I'll just do these few areas of white over on this side. And if this isn't making sense just yet, stay tuned. It'll make a little more sense when we start adding our inks to the background. So before I add my inks, I wanted to die cut. This is using our antique frame die cut. So I'm just holding it over and positioning it, and I ran that through my die cutting machine. Now off camera, I stamped a mask onto Eclipse masking paper, and then I cut the bottom portion of the scene from the top right along that fence line so that I can now mask the top portion, and I'm going to apply some Salty Ocean Distress ink just along the edge of that mask to create a bit of a shadow on the snow. I'm putting most of the ink actually onto the masked portion, and then just barely moving my ink blending tool with a foam pad off of the masked area, so just the lightest part of the ink extends onto the snowy area. And I'll peel up that mask, and you can see where it added that shadow. Now I'll use the other half of the mask to mask off the snow so I can work on the sky. Just lining that up. And then I like to save these, so I just stick them on a little piece of paper and stick it in the packaging with my stamp. Now to start with, I'm going to use Wild Honey Distress ink, again applied with an ink blending tool and a foam pad. And you can see now I do not have to worry about any of those snowy areas on the trees or across those branches because we sealed it in with that Versamarker and clear embossing powder. And I just put a very light layer of wild honey. Now this is just a punch circle, and I punched it from some thin typing paper. I'm putting a little double-sided tape on the back, patting it on my shirt to remove most of the stickiness, and then just placing it down as a mask. And I'm going to, starting on the circular area and sort of flicking outward, I'll apply some darker color next to spiced marmalade. And I am holding onto that circle because it isn't affixed to the paper very well. And again, starting on the circle and sort of using a flicking motion outward so that I get a nice edge along the edge of the circle. And then I will very lightly sort of extend that yellow color outward. And I'll remove the mask. And then I just wanted to make that a little bit less stark. So I am going back with the Wild Honey Distress ink over the entire thing, just so that the sun portion isn't quite as light as compared to the outer rim. Now I'll work on the blues for the sky. So I've grabbed that Salty Ocean color. I'm going to start off the edge and work my way on. I'm being careful not to let that intermix too much with the yellow so that I don't end up with green in the sky, because those colors will mix together. And I can go right over the trees with this too. All of that has been embossed. For a little bit more contrast up in the sky, I'm going to add just a touch of Mermaid Lagoon Distress ink. Now I'm going to take a paper towel and just buff over the top, but those were pretty bright, rich colors, so I'm going to take now a baby wipe and sort of wrap it around my finger and slide that across those branches. And you can see that goes to that nice bright white. It is so fun to do this part because it just is like magic that none of those other background colors are on there. And I can peel off the mask. I'm going to sort of soften this a little bit by applying a very light layer of antique linen around all of the edges. It also is a nice way to highlight those beautiful sort of torn paper antique look die cutting that is around the edge. And I'll do that also with Gathered Twigs Distress ink. And to add my snow, I'm just using a gel pen, and I'm sorry my camera didn't seem to want to focus on there, but it is listed in the supply list at the very end of the video up on screen. And I'm just drawing in the snow. I didn't want to mess around with flicking it on there, and I like that I can get small and larger flakes with this pen and sort of place them where I want them to be. I'm also going to take it and add just a touch of snow on top of the fence, so just very lightly coloring right on top of there in a few places. And then to finish things off, I just inked my note card with coordinating colors, the ones I used on the background, and layered that die cut and stamped piece onto that using dimensional adhesive. And also, before doing that, did stamp my sentiment with that potting soil ink. So here's another look at the finished card. I had such fun working on this. There's so many different variations. I think this is a stamp I could just play with all day and try and come up with lots of different backgrounds. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. You can also connect with Penny Black on Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, Instagram, our blog, and our website, and I've linked all of those for you down in the YouTube description box below. And here's that list of supplies that I promised, and I thank you so much for watching.